Good morning, everybody. I'm Ann Navaro from Washington, D.C., and I want to welcome all of you to the first of 4 weekly environmental essential webinars in the month of March. We are having these 4 in a row like this in order to give you the highlights of the fast-paced change in the federal government that's been triggered by the change in administration. Hopefully it will be a way for you to identify and focus on the most significant developments in the environment and energy space as a way of focusing your own efforts in terms of then doing a deep dive into the issues of most concern. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and we may have time at the end to answer some. And if we don't, we are happy to follow up with you individually. Our panel today, joining me are Scott Segal, Christine Wyman, and Brittany Pemberton. Scott and Christine are members of our policy resolution group. Between them, they have decades of experience dealing with the federal government and government relations, including transitions between the various administrations over the years. Brittany and I are members of the Environment and Natural Resources Practice Group, and we focus on related legal and policy matters. So today we are going to talk about what's happening at various agencies in the wake of the initial flurry of executive orders issued by President Biden in his first few days in office. Of course, those EOs directed the agencies to do many, many things, and so you all may be wondering what's going on. First, I'm going to turn to Scott Segal, who's going to give us an overview and talk about how politics is influencing implementation of the EO agenda items. Scott?
All right. Thanks very much. And you can hear me, Ann?
I can hear you, Scott. Thanks.
And the next sound you hear is me turning on a timer. Because Ann knows the last time we did an event like this together, I sponge-like sopped up a lot of the time. So I promise I won't do it. Okay, thanks, Ann. My goal is to provide a bit of an overview regarding the tool of executive orders, their purpose, their impact, their limitations, and then turn it over in each of the sort of bucket categories of what changes have been wrought or attempted to by executive orders to my colleagues on the panel. First, a little bit of perspective. You know, the Biden administration is not new in executive orders, even in issuing a flurry of executive orders at the beginning of the administration dealing with energy and environment. This has gone back some time. Now, for President Biden, the executive orders initially, at least, were a bit of a test because he had a truncated transition, official transition period because of the failure, frankly, of the General Services Administration to authorize the turning over of both materials and funding for transition. That said, it looks like they didn't really need it because they were hard at work. He had borrowed Cecilia Munoz from the Obama administration, who had long worked on executive orders and had a rather aggressive agenda. Every U.S. president has issued at least one executive order. Now, they didn't always use that nomenclature, but they have done it. And executive orders are consecutively numbered, and we're now almost getting to the 14,000 mark in terms of the numbers of EOs. Now, the executive order, of course, is not the only thing an executive can do at the outset of an administration. An executive can issue proclamations, which you sometimes see in terms of days of unity or things like that, which Joe Biden did as well. They can just announce executive actions, like the rejoining of the Paris Accord is a good example of that. They can issue presidential memoranda, which are essentially love notes from the White House to executive agencies, telling them to engage and begin a regulatory process, or they can put that mechanism within an executive order. So there's a lot of optionality. Every new administration, though, does release a flurry of executive orders at the front end. There's a lot of different ways to segregate types of executive orders, but I'll use my goofy nomenclature for you. One is hardy perennials. Every administration issues, just as an example, a pause button being pushed on pending regulatory actions to stop any flood of so-called midnight actions. All administrations do that. Democrats do that to Republicans. Republicans do that to Democrats. Ethics pledges is another example. Every incoming administration rediscovers the issue of government ethics, and so has to issue their own take on government ethics. This administration, no different. Even the Trump administration had a government ethics pledge. It was actually quite a strong one. This administration had a little bit of difference with respect to their executive orders because they also were attempting to address what I might call imminent harm in the sense that we're in the middle of a pandemic. In this case, extending the ban on evictions is a good example of that, freezing student loan payments. These are things that were all justified by the actual events on the ground occurring during January 20 through January 27, a period of a lot of activity in the issuance of executive orders. Another thing that I think Biden was attempting to do, President Biden, was to make good on day one campaign pledges. I've already talked about rejoining the Paris Accord, and we'll hear more about that a little bit later. But for example, lifting the travel ban was another day one promise, and there were others of those. In fact, if you did a Google search at the very end of last year for day one within 10 of Biden, you would have come up with a list that's even longer of what was actually released. But a lot of day one campaign promises were the subject of some attention in these initial executive orders. I think a lot of things that people are interested in is the advancement of a proactive agenda. And that, of course, is going to lead us to talking, and that includes not just energy, environment, natural resources, but also includes things like the Buy American provision and addressing a broad social justice agenda. Things like that were also subject to initial and early executive orders. Let's talk about climate change, energy, and the environment. I don't want to get into too much detail here because I see my colleague, Christine Wyman, and she's going to look at some of these things as well. But over meta principle here, an executive order can be used to rearrange governmental priorities, but cannot be used to change underlying statutory authorization or even appropriation where funding has been already identified for a particular spending purpose. You can't reprogram government spending by use of an executive order. Talking about energy and environment, that limits your options a little bit, but it doesn't eliminate your options altogether. We could sort of look at two tranches of action that have occurred on energy and environment, January 20th and January 27. What I'm about to say is not reflective of a hermetically sealed compartment, but I would say that January 20th was a little bit about examining Trump administration activities and putting some back in the bottle that the administration didn't agree with. It was a reactive agenda on the 20th. Whereas on the 27th, it's fair to say that it was a mapping out of a future agenda, a proactive agenda, essentially for the new administration. Now, that's not exclusively true. There are things that you could put in either category in each places. I took a look the other day at the actions of the January 27 signing of executive orders, and on the table, there were only a few executive orders signed, but there was so much substructuring of these executive orders that I counted, and some media sources did as well, at least 60 different actual actions that were called upon for the 27th. But there are limitations on executive orders. And I think here of those signs you can buy in airports that say, be calm and carry on. People sort of panicked initially at some of these energy and environment issues. The moratorium on new leases on federal lands, the timing of the announcement regarding the Keystone XL pipeline, the enhanced scrutiny of new permit actions on federal land. All that appeared rather frightening to upstream oil and gas, just as the emphasis on electric vehicles as opposed to liquid motor fuels must have appeared in the same way frightening to the downstream of the oil and gas industry. Yes. Okay. I am now being told that I'm out of time, man. So done. That's the word there. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Segal. Do you have any closing comments, Mr. Segal?
Yes, thank you. So my closing remark is the following: that while it is easy to get the jitters over executive orders, you have to remember they cannot change underlying law. They can't repurpose existing funding that's allocated for different purposes. Biden himself, decades and decades in government, is in fact someone who is an institutionalist and has actually told progressive interest groups that there's only so much he can do through executive orders, and that's why they have to join together in the legislative process to make durable or lasting change. And even when you view it through the lens of pending legislation, the president cannot so irritate moderate Democrats or all Republicans that he makes it more difficult to use the tools at his disposal, like even the so-called budget reconciliation process, which requires him to have 50 votes at least, plus Kamala Harris, in order to succeed. And too much irritation can absolutely get in the way. Executive orders can be a source of irritation, as we've seen them raised on several occasions during the confirmation process for Biden administration officials. That, Ann, I think is all I intended to say. So now I'm going to throw this thing out the window because it keeps clicking at me, and I'll turn it over back to you, Ann.
Thank you very much, Scott. So let's talk about what's actually going on in the last month plus since the executive orders have been issued at various agencies. I'm going to turn it over to Christine, who is going to focus on climate action and recent announcements about the social cost of carbon. Christine?
Great, thanks, Ann. So as Scott mentioned, the executive orders that President Biden has issued on energy and environment really established kind of a roadmap for the federal agencies in enacting his domestic policy agenda and to some degree global policy agenda. But on the issue of climate change, what we're seeing is really a whole of government approach to climate change. And what that means is that all agencies across the federal government, not just the ones that we are most accustomed to working on climate or energy issues or environmental issues, are really supposed to look at the impacts of their actions on climate change. But in order for them to meaningfully do that, they need the tools to do so. And that's where the executive orders come in and provide some of the tools that the agencies are expected to use as they consider climate impacts, in particular, the social cost of carbon. So what the social cost of carbon is, it's a metric of the range of estimates in dollars of what is considered the long-term impacts done by 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions. Said another way, it's the cost of society of releasing 1 ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in a given year. This is developed through a range of models and tools looking at a wide range of potential impacts from climate change. For example, lost productivity associated with, or lost agricultural productivity associated with shifting weather patterns, property damages from strong storms, and diminished freshwater availability. The value does, it provides an important tool for the Biden administration to advance their climate agenda because it allows agencies to consider the climate impacts or cost to society from their actions. And they do this primarily, or they could do this primarily through looking at the regulations that they might be looking at enacting and looking at the potential costs or benefits associated with climate change. For example, for a regulation that would have the impact of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the social cost of carbon can be used to increase the monetized benefits associated with the rule by putting a price on the greenhouse gas emissions that were reduced or not emitted. That then is compared to the cost of implementing technologies or controls or lack of productivity associated with not having those greenhouse gas emissions being emitted. So the past Friday, the administration took an important first step in establishing the social cost of carbon again. And what they did is they released an interim value that set the average social cost of carbon at $51 a ton for 2021. This includes a 3% discount rate. What this interim value was the Obama era social cost of carbon adjusted for inflation. But this is just the first in a series of steps on the social cost of carbon that was laid out by executive order. Recall that we said this is really more of a agenda setting or a roadmap for what the agencies are supposed to do. And here what the executive order did is it reestablished the interagency working group that had been established under the Obama administration for developing the social cost of carbon. And the first action item for them was setting this interim value. They're to develop a final social cost of carbon, as well as the social cost of methane and social cost of nitrous oxide by January 2022. For that value, what they'll be doing is taking public input though, to try to develop both probably a proposed social cost as well as the final social cost. And that's expected in January 2022. But in the interim, I think an important step to watch is that by September 2021, this interagency working group It's supposed to develop recommendations for how the federal agencies are to incorporate the social cost of carbon into federal procurement, federal budgeting, and federal decision making. This is an important step, I think, because it's going to provide the federal agencies with direction on how they are to use this value. And that will be really meaningful in how the Biden administration intends to use this value as it advances its climate agenda. The other issue that I wanted to mention is CEQ and their greenhouse gas NEPA guidance document. So one other item that was in the day one executive order was it directed CEQ to take action on this greenhouse gas NEPA guidance. This guidance is intended to provide agencies with the instruction on how they should consider greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts in their NEPA analysis. The EO directed CEQ to take two steps. First, withdraw the Trump proposed guidance. This has been done and is seen as largely symbolic. The second thing that it did was it directed CEQ to update the Obama final guidance and put that out. There's no date associated with that, and it hasn't been done yet. But obviously, that's something that's going to take more time and consideration. But an important step in that is also bringing leadership into CEQ, particularly the chair. And here we see important action happening this week. The President Biden has nominated Brenda Mallory as chair of CEQ. Mallory is familiar with the Council of Environmental Quality. She served as general counsel under the Obama administration, and for the last several years, she was head of regulatory policy at the Southern Environmental Law Center. Her confirmation hearing is scheduled for tomorrow before the Senate Environment Public Works Committee. Here, I'd expect questions regarding NEPA, the consideration of climate change, as well as another topic that CEQ is going to be very involved with under the Biden administration, and that is environmental justice. There's still a lot of open questions as to how the administration is going to incorporate environmental justice considerations into its decision-making, and I expect that Mallory will be getting a lot of questions from senators. So following the confirmation of Brenda Mallory, which will she'll have her hearing tomorrow, then she'll need to be reported out by the EPW committee, and then she'll need to be considered by the full Senate. That will provide necessary leadership at CEQ to take action on the CEQ NEPA guidance, as well as decide on another related topic, how they want to proceed on the CEQ's NEPA regulations, implement the Trump reforms that we saw coming out last year. There's an important date coming up in the litigation there of March 17th that DOJ is expected to provide substantive briefing on defending the rule. And we do expect an announcement from CEQ in advance of that, unless it gets pushed out again, to see where they might go on those, on either rescinding the rule in its entirety, providing specific line item revisions, or what I think most people do not expect to happen is leaving it in place in its entirety. So I think those are a couple of things to keep in mind coming from the executive orders and as they relate to climate change at the agencies. And back to you.
Thanks so much, Christine. Now I'm going to turn it over to Brittany Pemberton, who is going to talk a little bit about what EPA has been doing in response to the executive orders. Brittany?
Thanks, Anne. So what have EPA and DOJ been up to? I'm going to focus largely on two things, the first of which are actions that EPA has to review in roughly the next 6 months under one of those first day executive orders, which is number 13990, and the latest in litigation over Trump era rules. So Executive Order 13990 is entitled Protecting Public Health and the Environment and Restoring Science to Tackle the Climate Crisis. There's a lot of stuff, as Scott alluded to, jam-packed into that EO. I'm really going to focus on the protecting the public health and the environment part. That's what really pertains directly to EPA. The order lays out a number of things that EPA is to review and then issue a rule, either reconsidering, suspending, revoking, et cetera, those specific items. There are specific deadlines in the EO for those actions. So I'm just going to quickly kind of take us through what some of those rules and issues are before hitting the litigation. So out of the handful of items that are specifically listed in the EO that EPA's got to review, they've only taken public action on one so far. That's the so-called science transparency rule. That rule requires EPA to give greater weight to scientific studies with publicly available data, but only in some really specific situations, in particular in issuing regulations that are driven by the relationship between the dose and exposure of a pollutant and the response to it. EPA made that rule effective immediately when it was issued sometime late last year, using this good cause exception to the EPA's notice and comment provisions. That, along with just the general controversy of the rule itself, made it a prime target for litigation. And a district court just a few weeks ago determined that EPA hadn't justified making the rule effective immediately. And that opinion meant that the rule was about to spring back into effect on February 5th. So it was put on hold for just a couple of weeks instead of being automatically enforced. It was about to spring back into life on the 5th, but EPA moved almost immediately to vacate the rule, arguing that the prior administration really lacked the authority to issue it. EPA's motion was not surprising for a couple of reasons. One that I sort of already mentioned, which is that EO 13990 specifically asks EPA to look at this rule and to take action on it ASAP. There are only two rules in the EO that require action as soon as possible, and this is one of them. And then two, President Biden signed an executive order on the 27th of January that reestablished the President's Council on Advisors on Science and Technology, and he also issued a memorandum that same day that makes clear that the administration's policy is to make evidence-based decisions guided by the best available science and data. So that's the only item pertaining to EPA in that executive order that has had any sort of public forward movement. But I wanted to quickly hit just what the other items are in that EO so that you're generally aware of them. As I said, the EO gives the agency deadlines that range from as soon as possible to September 2021. I think those are all for proposed rules, so it's not that EPA has to take any final action between now and September, but they still need to move pretty aggressively in order to meet some of these deadlines. So the other rules at issue are the EPA cost-benefit rule. That requires transparency on the question of co-benefits, which in other words is which social benefits of the rule are actually attributable to the pollution reductions targeted by it versus reducing other pollutants that are not the subject of the rule. The MATS supplemental finding rule, there's sort of a long tortured history with this one, but it ties back into the Supreme Court's decision on Michigan versus EPA, which is about the appropriateness of regulating mercury and other hazardous air pollutants from EGUs. The Obama administration issued a rule in response to that decision, finding that the regulation was appropriate and necessary. The Trump EPA has reversed that, but they left the underlying standards in place since many of the companies complied years ago. So the question now before EPA is what to do with the supplemental finding and what to do with the standards themselves. There are a couple of issues tied up in the oil and gas NSPS, which is better known as the methane rule. There are a couple of ways that the EO requires EPA to look at and take specific action there, but the main goal is to really take forward steps in regulating methane directly from the oil and gas sector, including the possibility of first-time regulations of existing sources. The last rule that I'll mention is the Safe, Affordable, Fuel-Efficient Vehicles, or the SAFE Vehicles rule. There are a couple of parts to that, too, one of which is the California waiver that allows California to set more stringent greenhouse gas emission tailpipe standards. The other rule was a change in the actual standards themselves, sort of watering them down a bit from what the Obama administration had taken on. There hasn't been any public action on any of these, but EPA has at least alluded to the fact that it's going to act very quickly on the safe vehicles rules, unveiling some interim standards probably by April. So what else has been going on? In addition to the EO itself and the regulations that are called out in it, the administration also issued, along with the EO, a fact sheet that has a very lengthy list of potential actions for various agencies to review. There are 48 items on that list for EPA, one for DOJ. The EO also required all of the agencies subject to it to transmit to the Office of Management and Budget by February 19th a list of rules that the agencies intend to review before the end of 2021. There's another deadline in 90 days for items that they're going to spend time on over the length of the administration. EPA apparently has met its deadline of sending that initial list of items for shorter-term action over, but they haven't said much publicly about what is actually in their list. That may be because, Michael Regan, who's the Biden administration's nominee for EPA administrator, has not been confirmed yet, and they just want to make sure that there's no additional heat on him by saying too much about what their priorities are. On the flip side of that, DOJ has taken a step to address the one rule that was sort of assigned to it in all of this. That is to rescind a number of policy documents, the upshot of which was to really prohibit the use of supplemental environmental projects. DOJ rescinded all of that on February 4th, but they still need to take some action if they're going to undo a rule that codified all of that. And then just quickly, the other really forward momentum that you can see as a result of these executive orders is putting a lot of the Trump-era litigation on hold. The D.C. Circuit has done that at the request of EPA in a number of cases, including the mass supplemental finding rule, the cases that deal with the two parts of the safe vehicles rule, and the methane policy rule. So since we're short on time, I will send it back to Anne. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Brittany. And we may go over by a couple of minutes, but I won't take too much more of your time this morning. And I really appreciate everybody listening. So I think, as you can tell from what we've said so far, there's a lot going on in response to the executive orders, but there's also a lot not going on publicly yet because of the lack of confirmed officials at the head of these agencies. They're going to be sensitive to not doing anything too dramatic that might further complicate confirmation hearings. I want to talk briefly about the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Department of the Interior, and a little bit more about the Department of Justice. We're also going to do a deep dive into the Department of the Interior in 3 weeks, and I'm sure there will be new developments to share at that point. In terms of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and a lot of you may deal with them primarily, I would think, in the permitting arena under the Clean Water Act or the Rivers and Harbors Act. Obviously, the geographic scope of the Clean Water Act in terms of the definition of waters of the United States is on the hit list for the Biden administration to reconsider. That has not happened yet, even though I believe all the litigation related to the Trump-era definition has been put on hold for request from the Department of Justice in the various cases. The other rule that was on the list in terms of being directed under the executive order review is the Corps of Engineers repromulgation of a subset of the nationwide permits. And as you all may know, the nationwide permits are meant to permit with little or less paperwork certain activities subject to the Corps' jurisdiction. And one of those permits has been particularly controversial, Nationwide 12, which permits regulated activities related to the construction of oil and gas pipelines. So one of the executive orders directed the government to consider whether those new nationwides should not go into effect. They go into effect on March 15th. So far, there is no indication that they will not do so. The Corps still has a little bit of time to get a notice in the Federal Register indicating that they're not going to go into effect, but at this stage, it's probably less likely that they are going to be suspended. So while it's still a little bit unclear, at this point, the new round of nationwides is still going into effect. Again, I think we need to watch it over the next week or so to see what happens. And this may be in part because, as of yet, the Corps of Engineers does not have kind of a political member of the Biden team devoted to them. As you all may know, the Corps of Engineers itself does not have any political appointees. The political appointees are at the Assistant Secretary of the Army level above the Corps. And there are no political members yet of the team really focusing on the Corps. The Biden administration has announced the appointment of Mr. Jamie Pinkham to be the deputy for the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works over the Corps. But as far as I know, he is not yet in place. I want to turn for just a couple of minutes to the Department of the Interior. As you all may know, the Secretary of the Interior nominee, Representative Holland, has had her hearings. The Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee is scheduled to vote on her this coming Thursday morning in terms of whether to recommend her to the full Senate. Assuming that happens, I think we expect some fairly lively process on the Senate floor before she ultimately, I think is more likely than not, that they will vote to confirm her. But Senator Daines from Montana has vowed to put some process, I think, in the way of that ultimate vote. And that's because, of course, of one of the more controversial executive order directives, which was to the Interior Department, to pause oil and gas leasing on public lands while that program is further evaluated. The Department of the Interior hasn't yet taken any formal or official action to pause leasing or indicate what the scope of the pause or the review will be. I don't expect that they will do that until after Representative Holland is confirmed. Of course, on day one, the Department of the Interior did issue a secretarial order that elevated decision-making for many of the Department of the Interior's actions to a very senior level in Washington. So you have a very small number of people who right now have the authority to approve a huge array of actions in front of the department, including actions relating to mineral extraction on public lands. That being said, I think after the initial kind of freeze related to that secretarial order, we are now beginning to see some types of actions being approved, like applications for permits to drill oil and gas on federal land. Some are slowly being approved. And I think the bureaus of the agency are also getting more comfortable that some very minor actions that allow kind of day-to-day business can go forward at the field level. But there's certainly a lot more to come there after we get through confirmation. I wanted to mention two other things that Interior has done in the wake of the executive orders. Per the executive director, Interior has delayed the efficacy of the Trump administration's role related to oil and gas royalties on public lands. And royalties, can be kind of an in-the-weeds issue. It's a very complex area of the law. But for those of you who deal with production from federal lands, you know how key it is and how important it is. The specifics of the regulations really dictate ultimately how much is owed. So royalties have been a target of environmental advocates as they've argued for years that companies don't pay enough. And it will be interesting to see whether Interior revisits the rule currently in place, and especially if it tries to account for the social cost of carbon in some way in ultimate royalty rates. I also just wanted to mention one more thing, and that's the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. As you all may know, the interpretation of that act has gone back and forth to some extent. For years, the government interpreted it as criminalizing both direct and indirect take of birds covered under the act. The Trump administration adjusted the interpretation so that it only applied direct or purposeful take of birds and not indirect take of birds. Per the executive orders, the relevant agencies have considered that. The Department of Justice has dropped a related appeal at the Second Circuit. And the Department of the Interior has delayed the efficacy of the Trump administration rule. So I expect that we will see a robust return to the previous interpretation of that act as criminalizing both direct and incidental or indirect take of birds. So here we are at 10:04 a.m. Obviously, we had a lot to say, and 30 minutes is not a long time to say it in. So please feel free to follow up with any one of us, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks very much.